Awesome. So can I invite Michael and Bonnie to the front to do the presentation, please? So before I get started, I'll just introduce Michael and Bonnie. So Michael Bacina is a partner at Piper Alderman, leading their cryptocurrencies and blockchain team. He has advised a number of significant projects in Australia, including Kenya and Loki, and is a regular panel attendee in Australia and internationally. His team advises on the whole token sale process, from ideation through to public token sales, and including securities analysis, structuring, contracts, and tax matters. So yeah, if there are any potential projects in the list today, definitely go hit up Michael, very knowledgeable in the area. And Bonnie Yu is a blockchain consultant in strategy and legal. Prior to that, she was a lawyer at international firms in Sydney and in Silicon Valley. So I guess, welcome back to Sydney. You've been back for a while, but yeah, we're very happy to have her back. Yes. Okay, so I guess to get things started, I have a question for both of you. I guess from my perspective, this is an industry that is quite a hot topic, but also I think it's quite controversial. So in your work as legal professionals, I think you're typically thinking of things about risk compliance and things like legally compliance. So what is your personal take on when you hear critics of I guess the blockchain industry, its potential development, and also crypto assets in particular?
Go in there first and pass it to me. Look, I think that a lot of the critics, you've been able to see which media outlets have published more critical stories over time. In Australia, particularly the AFR has taken a fairly negative view until very recently. I was very pleased to see a lot of stories they've published have changed. I think that a lot of the critics are just on the wrong side of history, and a lot of the fear that comes out of it is just driven by that. They don't understand it or feel that it's a threat to the status quo or to their jobs. I always say to people, look, everyone got worried about AI taking people's jobs. It's really more of a blockchain plus machine learning that will take a lot of people's jobs and make a lot of things more efficient. But it's difficult other than taking an educative approach to people who are naysayers, because criticism is really good when it's constructive and identifies problems. As you heard Dan say, issues around keys, everybody who, I think, can anyone put up their hand and say when they first got into crypto, they had no issues with private keys or never worried about losing their key? No hands. Everybody gets freaked out about losing their keys at some point when they first get into crypto, which is why things like Tensor are really exciting projects to take away that pain point. But I think that as long as there's constructive criticism coming, it's good. The naysayers who simply say it's not going to happen, they're just going to be left aside as other people get on with the job of bringing more implementations.
So, I completely agree with what Michael has said. And in fact, I think that for the reason why there could be so, let's say, criticism in the area is because I think a lot of the projects have come out with the white paper, and then I think that the community or people that are looking into the space needs to understand that in business, so just because you're crypto doesn't mean that you are divorced of being the business in itself, and you need time to build it. So whilst you have a white paper, there needs to be time for people to actually roll out the roadmaps. And in fact, I think that if you are a very solid project and if you know where you are going towards, then with time it will tell. So, yeah.
And I think I'll only add to that, there's quite a few headlines around the 90% plus ICO projects from 2017 that have failed, but in the context of, say, the normal startup world and the failure rates, it's not that unusual. I think as we go through this year, there'll be a lot of projects from last year that we'll start to see their real-world developments. Slight plug for my client, Kenya just turned on their alpha marketplace a couple of days ago, and so seeing one of Australia's top 3 raisers in an ICO actually deploying a product and starting to test it, albeit with centralized elements, is part of the evolution of getting to where it needs to be, and also showing people that it's not as scary as it sounds, and giving them something they can use day to day, which goes to that issue of adoption. I almost put up my hand, but I haven't signed up to their Alpha platform yet, so I couldn't say I'm using a blockchain platform day to day yet.
So I guess actually following on a bit from that, in terms of the concept of we like as the regulation gets a bit more clear and probably as people become a bit more responsible with the way that they do their projects and do their ICOs and have more of a real world reality to it as opposed to being sort of the bottom pipe. What are you both seeing as some of the trends or maybe like upcoming regulations that you think that most projects should be looking out for?
Well, I'd say one trend that I've seen from the start of this year really markedly has been existing businesses with big user bases deciding that they're going to start diving into piloting or aggressively disrupting themselves because someone within the organisation has seen, okay, this technology is going to be huge. So increasing inquiries coming into my group are from these kinds of businesses, and when they're coming in with very significant 6 or in some cases 7-figure user bases already, those kinds of businesses are poised to push through adoption, but also to a degree probably influence how the regulation happens, because when it's merely startups and people who don't understand how the regulators work versus established players who do understand how the regulators work, there's a different dynamic at play when it comes to actually deploying things and dealing with those grey areas. I think there's perhaps in some cases a little bit more trust because the regulators will say, okay, well, there's someone who's been in business 5 or 10 years or 20 years in a couple of cases I've seen, and now they're going to be bringing this new technology in, but they've got a lot to lose if they get it wrong, versus a startup that, okay, if they get it wrong, they'll just fold the company and start again somewhere else.
Yeah, so I think that one of the issues is because I actually work along with startups in both strategy and legal, so I think that the way that I look at it is both being very commercial and also being compliant at the same time. So I think that there are always some threshold questions, like every company that wants to do ICO will think about threshold questions like, is this a security, is this a financial product, or is it not? Which jurisdiction do I do it in? So these two are tied together because different legislations will, different jurisdictions will have a different definition of it. And so if you're a global business, by nature, you have to be dealing with multi-jurisdictional problems. And I think one of the more interesting things is I've actually been working with a Netherlands-based company. Quite recently, we've been looking into the issue of privacy. So they're working in the area of identity, and one of the really interesting things is in the context of Australia, our privacy laws governed by privacy principles essentially regulates how organisations and governments collect your personal information. So there's a real question about, if some of your, first of all, what's the definition of personal information, and if it's pushed onto the blockchain, what are the implications of those issues? Because it's no longer a centralised organisation that's dealing with your information. It's a decentralised by nature, and you've got different nodes handling that information. So that's one really interesting question. The second of all, because they're based in the Netherlands, they have to deal with European regulations, and one of the principles is in fact the right to be forgotten. So how do you forget in the context of a ledger that doesn't allow you, well, by definition, it's immutable, right? So
you're saying they have a law that says that their citizens
yes.
have a right
Correct.
to have their information be forgotten.
Yes.
Really?
Yeah. So that
We don't have that.
We don't have that.
Not in
No.
Australia. I find that very foreign.
And
concept.
Google just lost a case in what was that out of the UK that one was from?
I think so.
A very general
Similar
grant.
to that.
Yeah, he had some criminal records, and Google said, no, we're not taking it off the search results because people had a right to know, and he said, no, I want my criminal record gone from your search results.
Because I have a.
There were 2 guys suing, one guy won, so they took off one guy, so they didn't take off the other guys, but he ultimately won at court, and that court ordered them to pull it from the search results. So that's how it manifests itself. But Bonnie says, if you can't, because you've designed a system that will then allow, once the information is out there, to no longer be in your control, how does the law respond? And legislatures are yet to kind of figure it out, because the technical answer is you can't do anything about it anymore. It's out there.
Yeah, so I guess there's some technical solution like zero-knowledge proof that can actually bypass this problem, but then again, let's not get too technical. I think the overarching problem is that once you push that information out there, what is sensitive information and what is personal information? So I think those are really interesting issues to grapple with, and in fact, regulations are yet to catch up. So that's where we're at.
And I think that's really not so simple. It's really about, as the creation of law, what the society thinks, what society's values are at that place. So for people to think what it is that we want to be done.
Correct.
And, I mean, just as an example, I think, Michael, you also practice in litigation, and one of the interesting things about IP is that the courts here, the federal courts, have decided that your IP address is not necessarily your personal information, but the same may not be applied overseas. Your IP address that links you to your IP
Yeah,
address.
so it does not count as personal information in this jurisdiction.
Not in Australia,
Okay.
but elsewhere,
It
they're
does
subject to a
count.
different interpretation. So I think that there are many issues when you go global.
Yeah.
You really need harmony, but can harmony be achieved? And I think that it's sometimes, it's quite difficult. So we are grappling with issues like that.
I mean, as a law student, I always felt that the law just cannot catch up with technology and also applicable as well. Like I just, I don't know the answer to that, and it's just, the world is organized in a certain way, but we live and we use, everyday life in a way that's different now.
Exactly, and it's not going to catch up anytime soon. By the
Yeah,
time it
no.
catches up, blockchain
Yeah.
technology will
Be
be
something
gone,
else, yeah.
and
Yeah.
it'll be very difficult for law to ever really catch up
Yeah.
to technology. Ever since the computers have become widespread, the legal principles, it's just the nature of who makes the laws and who interprets the laws
Yeah.
is baked into a certain demographic curve, and that sits behind where a lot of the technological development comes. So really, it's probably going to end up with the technology driving things in a certain direction until there's a breaking point for a regulator to get involved.
Yeah.
But privacy is very difficult because even today you have situations where very large databases of credit card information, of people's personal information, hardly a month goes by that you don't hear about yet another poor Fortune 500 company getting hacked.
Yeah.
But it's the same kind of principle. Once the database is out there, it's out there, and it's either available on the dark web or elsewhere, which is not too dissimilar to if it was on a public blockchain accessible to all, except that there's a little bit of effort required to get to it if it's been stolen by hackers. But it'll be very interesting to see when we see eventually the first major compromise of either a permission blockchain with a lot of people's personal information on it, or people's sovereign identity, because the whole point of using someone's sovereign identity from a blockchain becomes problematic if that can be compromised or gets compromised, and a lot of the information goes off and is misused. Identity theft becomes a whole lot simpler if you can do it end-to-end from a computer.
Yes, but just to add to that also, I think it's quite interesting. I mean, I can only share the insight from an Australian perspective, but just before Christmas, in fact, with Leon here, we attended an ASIC meeting in which really the regulators came out and said, look, this is a new area, we don't want to stifle innovation, but we don't really necessarily fully understand what's going on, and we don't have the answers. So they've actually said, we would like the industry to tell us what you see as the best practice going forward. And so they've actually, told a group of lawyers and industry people, provide us with some feedback about what you see as best practice and how we can do it right. Because if we do it, we're not the users of this technology. We don't live and breathe this. We don't know this. Whereas you are the industry people who know, so share your thoughts with us. So I think that in that way, ASIC has really come up and be quite progressive, and my understanding is many jurisdictions around the world are also doing similar things, but I can't really speak to it.
Michael, can you speak to, in terms of are you aware of what suggestions would industry be giving, and do you, are there any indications of?
I think that ASIC's having I don't want to steal any of their thunder on their
yeah.
Thursday, on their presentation on Thursday.
That's exactly what I'm getting at, Michael.
If you're not on the wait list or you have a ticket already, I think there was a
I do have a
wait
ticket,
list.
but for those who don't have a ticket, they can find out now.
We'll find a video feed link. Does everyone know about ASIC's roadshow tour they've been doing?
They scheduled the base last week anyway.
So some people have been to the
I was there
in Melbourne one.
So you're in the Melbourne stop.
Yeah, exactly. So I've had the links to the live stream.
There's more guidance coming.
Well,
More guidance.
Info 225 will be updated, but I understand that the update will not necessarily be what everyone would hope it would be in terms of giving bright line guidance.
Yeah.
I think, as Bonnie said, the regulators are grappling and trying not to come down with a hammer accidentally. But it means that the flip side, a lot of people, lawyers included, would dearly love to have the regulator say, here's a bunch of boxes. If you tick those boxes, you're fine. But they don't want to do that for fear of creating a box that no one can tick. So there's this balance going on back and forth, and I think it'll start to settle down more by the end of this year, and we'll see some token sales come out with more best practice alignment that I think will be...
There's about 10 ways you can do a token, so there's basically real problems with saying they want a red line test.
Exactly.
They would just be see.
Well, but, I mean, there's certain bright line tests that exist already
Yeah.
of some people putting things out there saying, oh, you're going to have a dividend share or a profit share off the back of our token. Huge red flag. It's going to be a security. But you're right. Leon's right. There's a whole lot of shades of grey in between, and elements that look a little bit like financial products in many projects, but the way that the regulations work and are interpreted, sometimes the regulator might say, no, that's really incidental to what's being provided, or no, this is actually central to what's being provided, and therefore we want to see licensing around it. But again, it's grappling to apply laws that were never designed with things like cryptocurrency in mind, and trying to find how they can be applied to meet the policy objectives of the regulators, which is largely protecting your mum and dad investors and consumers who might use a platform at the end of the day. So keeping that in mind is how a lot of ultimately the regulation tries to frame itself, but otherwise to have the markets working efficiently.
So would I be correct in assuming that most people would not want to be considered a security?
I think that the trend continues that most people running token sales want to try and ensure that their token is not going to inadvertently cross over a security line, because the penalties under the Corporations Act, if you're a proprietary limited company accidentally engaging under Chapter 60 fundraising is not great. So
will
people try and stay away from that.
Yeah, but will there be other projects who want to be a security?
Absolutely.
Yes. Oh, there's a number of projects already out there that are saying we want to issue a security in a tokenized form, and ASICS has indicated that they see no issue with using blockchain as a way, for example, of managing ownership of assets, or even going perhaps so far as securities, as long as the existing regulations are complied with. So the big scare, of course, around token sales is what token sale could be considered a managed investment scheme. But I don't think someone who says, I'm going to run a managed investment scheme but use tokens to manage who owns the shares in the schemes is going to have nearly as much of a problem as someone who's running a managed investment scheme and is not drawing that line, or is saying, I'm a utility token. And I've had people come to me who say, I'm a utility token. People will get a dividend from the revenue I make. And I say, no, you're not. Yes, I am, because I'm a utility token. They just don't get it. So you have that secondary problem with a lot of people who've never dealt with the Byzantine laws of securities and anti-money laundering coming into contact with a regulatory system that is used to dealing with people who've worked in the industry a long time and understand how things work and what everything means. I mean, the recent digital currency exchange guidance from Austrac is probably the most plain English document that's ever come out of Austrac. And it's great work from ADCA and the exchanges who are involved in getting it done and making sure it was written in a really plain English way that everybody who I've seen look at it has a better understanding of how our anti-money laundering system works. But if you pick up the Act, I mean, there are plenty of lawyers out there who look at the Act and want to shoot themselves in the head. It's a very difficult Act to read.
Stop everyone stone cold, I would say.
Exactly. It's second only to tax law in just the difficulty of reading it and understanding it.
Segue to my next question. But no, seriously, but yeah, so I did want to actually ask, even though you're both not tax lawyers and this is not tax advice, but in terms of as a token owner, right, and the intention of the law behind my tax liabilities as an individual, I think Michael, you had a very interesting point about what people tend to get confused about.
Well, first of all, you know this is being recorded. Look, I think it's fading now, but towards the start of the year, everybody was going around with a no, it's money in, money out approach to effectively the capital gains tax on token sales. And I think a lot of that came out of America, which uses an end of December tax year. And a lot of people saying, no, I'm going to treat it only when I get the cash in or cash out. And some accountants saying, that's an easy way of doing it, which of course is fine if someone has within a tax year bought something and completely sold out of it and got their cash out. Yeah. But that kind of approach of treating cryptocurrency trading or buying and selling is it breaks as soon as your ownership crosses over, for the Americans, 31 December or for here, 30 June, because then you're buying something or changing it within a tax year without liquidating it into fiat currency. So a number of people have posited that the recent downturn, which thankfully seems to have ended in the last week or so, was driven not insubstantially by the end of the American tax year, and a lot of people going to accountants who finally said, actually no, cash in, cash out is not the right way to do it. You have to go and sell a bunch of your crypto assets to make sure you have cash now because you moved it into an ICO. So the classic thing that people overlook is they bought some Bitcoin, they bought some Ethereum, it's gone up massively in value, and they say, great, there's a token sale on.
Yeah.
But then Ethereum token sales open. I'm going to buy a bunch of those. And
So
when
they
they
sell
when they pay in Ether, as far as most tax offices in the Western world are concerned, that was a disposal for the value of the Ether. So if I bought some Ether and then it went up 10x, and then I give it to Dan for his Tenzorum tokens, I've just made 10 times my money as far as the tax office is concerned. They treat it as if I sold it for cash, gave the cash to Dan, who then gave me the tokens. And that seems to be the fundamental mistake that a lot of people ran into. The secondary issue is, of course, not keeping records. The ATO has been pretty clear that they consider there is a personal use exemption, but I've also heard some tax folks say, similar to the SEC, saying there could be utility tokens, but I've never seen them saying there is a personal use exemption, but we've never seen anyone who would fall under it, because that seems to be leading towards an interpretation where if you buy Bitcoin and spend it the next week on coffee, or you buy a crypto and use it very, very closely to when you bought it, then you might be fitting under this $10,000 cap where you can avoid capital gains tax. But if the tax office was to audit you and you have a record of trading crypto regularly and not using it up shortly after buying it for some good or service, then I think it's going to be really hard to get under that. But there's a lot of people who misunderstand that and think, oh no, as long as I dispose of it in less than $10,000 chunks, I don't have to pay tax. One thing to be aware of is the ATO has come out and said part of the AML registrations under AUSTRAC, effectively controlling the on and off ramps to crypto through the exchanges, is a path that they will use to find out how people have been trading. Because once your identification is, of course, in something like BTC markets, it's relatively straightforward for the ATO to find out about your trading in there and get those records. Now, BTC markets, as an example, they're one I'd like to see their reporting change, because I've pulled out stuff for my self-managed super fund to go through its annual audit of trading activities, and it's really hard. So the other problem is, it's not like share trading, where if you were buying BHP shares at the end of the year, you get a lovely statement that you don't need to understand, because you can just give it to your accountant, and the accountant goes, great, I'll work it out, you made or lost this much money, and this is how much tax you need to pay. We don't have that on most Australian exchanges, but I suspect we'll have it very soon. There's a lot of people working on that, because it's not that hard to automate it within a centralised platform. But the ATO's position is, if you want to claim personal use, you better keep really good records of it. So the main takeaway is people keeping records of any trading activity is really useful. If you ever read things like, if you frequent Reddit,
Yeah, but that's my problem.
People will say,
I want to do the
there's no
right
records.
thing. I want to do the right thing, but it's like, and I'm not one of those heavy traders. But if you are, it's really impossible. I mean, how are you going to? Go back now,
there is an issue, because I remember
especially we have multiple exchanges.
Multiple exchanges, multiple currencies.
Yes.
Well, as I say, I had to do it for my self-managed super fund into setting up a Zcoin node, and it was a nightmare, because Bitrex's records just suddenly disappeared, and they didn't go back more than a month for a while, and all my trades were gone. And so I had to go back and just figure out the prices on the day and rebuild it, and it was the worst Sunday afternoon of my life. There's a reason I did a year of accounting and then stuck firmly with law. It's really hard, so it wouldn't surprise me if the ATO decides to tread softly, but it also wouldn't surprise me if they go hard and try to make some examples. The ABC is running a
more well-known, wealthy individuals to make examples out of.
Well,
let the record show you.
Yeah.
Well, that's it. They have a limited enforcement budget, and they need to go after the people they want to make an example of.
Exactly, right.
But the reality is, and the ABC's done a really good expose on this around issues of small businesses coming under the tax office scrutiny, and people don't understand this. If you read on Reddit, it's filled with people saying, oh no, the tax office will never know, except for that public ledger that shows all the transactions. But even worse, if the tax office comes after you for unexplained wealth, the onus switches, and it's not up to them to prove that you've done anything wrong. It's up to you to prove that you did the trading in a compliant way, which is, of course, is the opposite of what everyone's taught, and everyone has in their mind innocent until proven guilty, not on tax. So you have to take this very defensive position on, oh crap, I need to keep really good records. And as I say, there's more technology coming out as we go, and I suspect the reality is that they would never be able to enforce and audit everyone. The government would go broke. But I think they'll pick some people to go after who are high profile or really blatantly engaging in extremely wealthy lifestyles who are obviously not paying tax. Or they can simply track down because someone has a tip jar on a website and they can tie the address into the name. don't know how they're going to address zero-knowledge proof and privacy coins. I suspect they're just going to have to put that off to another day.
Run to Monero.
But the fundamental point is now, to the extent that if you have trading records on a third-party exchange, I pull them off or dump them into an Excel file or something in case you can't get them from the exchange later, because it's awful if you have to go back to public records of what prices were and try and manually match it up. You could do it in Excel, but it'll take you a whole Sunday afternoon to work out. There are better things to do on a Sunday afternoon.
I don't think normal people are that smart to work that out. I think you overestimate just really Sunday afternoon. Yeah, well, we'll see. We'll see. Now you know.
So if I can just add to that, I think that there is actually really good guidance that came up from ATO. I took a look at it a couple of days ago. I think it's quite self-explanatory about exactly what they're looking at. So I think there are a couple of things. I think for just normal users like myself, there are really two main things. One is when you as Michael was saying, keep really good records, because those records will actually support you if you get audited and need to keep them for 7 years. So that's obviously something very important. But at the moment, as far as I'm aware, they're really just looking at the on-ramp and off-ramp, which means that when you go from fiat to crypto and from crypto to fiat. But in fact, an interesting thing at the moment, they're saying that when you sell your crypto, that is a capital gains event. So at the moment, I was just seeing a petition going around saying, accountants saying, look, this is just not fair. This is not how we envisioned it should be taxed. So I think that this is definitely an evolving area. But just for a snapshot, a 5-minute read about what your tax obligations are, apart from going to your tax lawyer, definitely take a look at ATO's website. It's actually quite clear.
Very responsible, reassuring comments. Like 3 months till tax time.
Yeah,
2 months. Yeah, 2 months.
I actually haven't even done the recording, and I'm just completely frightened about it, because you would look at it and there's just no indication about why I bought it or what I've done with it. So it's going to be a complete nightmare. So.
It is, but I will say there is some really neat. Share with you my Sunday afternoon. There's some really neat Google Sheets functions which can pull in the prices from any date on any currency pretty much. I think they bring them in from CoinMarketCap. So if worse comes to worse, you have to take a crash course in understanding spreadsheets, obviously, but also getting into some of the formula. But you can reconstruct stuff in a way that isn't too painful once you work out how to use the formulas in there. But for those who, obviously, the more you trade,
exactly.
the bigger a problem it becomes, because it becomes exponentially more difficult. And
so my solution has been just buy and hold. I just don't
correct,
want to
the
trade
solution. Never
I'm very
settle.
concerned.
As long as everyone holds, there's no problem.
So one, so that you only just have that one, as opposed to jumping between different coins. That's
correct.
Yeah.
But I think once the ATO is a bit more into the on-ramps, they are going to be looking at the crypto to crypto, particularly in the token sales space, because it's a relatively easily tracked transaction, and it looks like a classic disposal of an asset purchase of another asset for CGT. So, but the ASIC probably of an agency has the best understanding of crypto. Tax office, I think, have some very talented individuals in there, but as a percentage of the whole, it's still tiny. Just like as a percentage of the whole community, those who understand blockchain and crypto is very tiny, and we're early at the adoption curve. So that's going to slow the regulators down as well. But there are lawyers and accountants who are working tirelessly to try and help everyone to get things moving in a direction that will hopefully not be too oppressive.
So just one interesting thing also is at the moment, because fiat to crypto exchanges are actually having to comply with the AML laws, what that actually says to you is that they would then look at transactions and the amount of that transaction that you're going through. So for example, the threshold is $10,000. But under the AML obligation, you also have to report suspicious transactions, and they can amount to close to $10,000. So you would often have instances where people, have 3 transactions of $3,000 through, so they're just under the threshold, and those are also transactions that they could, exchanges have to report on. So just something to keep in mind. But not to say we're doing anything suspicious, but just to say that those are the things.
That seems like advice to, if you wanted to money
No. But I'm explaining that they also have an obligation.
To report things that actually not just 10,
which they previously didn't have.
I abstract everything down to 1 cent.
Yeah.
I know that for a fact.
So do you have personal experience?
I did a lot of information
Yeah.
request to them.
Yeah.
because they were looking at what I wanted, what I was doing, so I just thought I would look at what they were doing.
Yeah.
They sent me 2 inches.
Wow.
Because I have an account where I can move critical amounts of money cross-border for for 0 cost, like 2 cents or 10 cents. They had all those records. But there's no magical 10,000 limits. If you did a $100 transaction or $5 transaction, Austrac has that.
Well, it all depends on the AML policy that the reporting entity adopts. And that feeds into what it is. So for that entity, they may have decided under their policy, cross-border transactions of any amount will be reported to Austrac to be on the safe side. So it just depends who you're dealing with, and you won't necessarily be able to access, and probably never will, their actual AML policy. If you look on the websites that say, here's our policy now, it's very, very brief, just say, we'll report things broadly, but internally they're required to have a more sophisticated policy for identifying transactions. They can't tell you, because then you'll be able to bypass their policy. But the whole AML Act is about risk assessment by reporting entities to say, well, what's likely to be suspicious, and just show Austrac they've thought about it, and then make sure those kinds of transactions are being reported. So yeah, cross-border is a heightened risk, but they're not tracking transactions of small amounts, say, between Australian accounts. I'd be very, very surprised unless the reporting entity is doing it, and then you find out that the Commonwealth Bank has just not reported.
So maybe you're very suspicious.
I think their policy was your transactions will be a simulated resistance is futile.
Anyway, wow. Well, thanks for revealing that to everybody. Okay, so the next question, something I'm personally very interested in, addressed to Bonnie, is from your work and your experience, what do you see as the future of tokens?
Yes, I mean that
in terms of what's going to be coming up, what's going to be the future development.
I mean the interesting thing is Daniel just before this panel discussion talked about I mean, if you take a look at what's out there, in fact, if we take a look at top 100 cryptocurrencies on CoinMarketCap, most of them, 99% of them, can be classified as utility tokens. And what that means is that it actually powers the network to which it operates, but it's got nothing to do more than to actually power the network. And so I think that the really interesting thing is, and a project that I'm working with is actually tokenizing traditional liquid assets. It's a subset of just traditional assets, and it's by nature.
So like asset-backed?
Yes, but I mean, I guess we can think about it as shares or any sort of financial product, but those products are actually highly liquid anyway, so they don't actually benefit from being tokenized. But what I'm talking about is, for example, a solar power plant or a property, because they have a high liquid premium, which means that, let's say, the owner of a solar farm wants to sell the solar farm in a hurry, they probably have to discount it by about 20 to 30%. And if we take a look at the infrastructure market, that market cap of the liquid assets in itself can constitute 20 to 30% of the asset's actual value. So if you're unable to unlock that, I think that it will be multitudes size of the current cryptocurrency market and really bring about value. And the important thing is it actually has a crossover effect, because then utility tokens actually can power something on its network as opposed to just existing to transfer minimal tokens, which at the moment don't really have much real life applications. So I think that, considering that I'm working with some really credible companies in this area, and at the same time hearing about a lot of credible companies looking into doing something similar, my personal opinion is the future will be in tokenizing these liquid assets, which benefits the most.
So would that make those tokens securities then?
Yes.
The whole nature of them will be securities,
Yes.
So it's like really the financial industry innovation, and that's what I find so exciting about this whole area.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things is people are very, I think a lot of companies are afraid to actually develop something useful and to just call it a security. I think a lot of people are saying, look, I want to do an ICO, but I definitely don't want to be a security, so I'll do anything but a security. And I think that actually limits the business, because you're not thinking in terms of, at the end of the day, you're a business and you have to build something that is of use, that will be long lasting. And I think that in order to think about the token economy, you have to say, look, this actually delivers value, and you should just pursue it if it makes sense for your company. So it doesn't make sense for all companies. Maybe utility tokens make sense for you, but I see a lot of companies that are just doing it because they want to sidestep the securities law, and I think that there will be problems.
Yeah.
Plus, if we take a look at the trading happening on CoinMarketCap, if you think about it, utility token is akin to just a transaction fee. If you have tokens that are extremely high value, how does that actually help with a real life application when you actually want to use it? Because when the product is developed and you say, I need to get, you need to acquire a token for $10 as opposed to $1 because it's risen by that much, then how do you actually practically use it? So I think that token economy needs to be really thought about if you want to build proper business.
So true. But then in the tokens that are security scenario, does that mean that bigger companies now who already have the right legal framework and licenses, like they would be able to do a token that is security, whereas like a smaller player find it not so difficult to make?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like any company, like if you have some form of seed funding, I don't find compliance to be particularly difficult, probably because I come from a compliance background.
But then why would current startups not want to be
Because you
security?
have much higher disclosure obligations and reporting obligations, and it's just much more onerous process to go through.
Yeah, so there's a higher ongoing cost for them in effect. Plus, it's an additional area of a lot of unknowns where they have to hire expensive advisors to help them navigate that. So I think, a lot of people try and drive towards, okay, well, let's do what we can do really well and we know, and try and avoid this unknown black hole of expense and complexity that we don't understand and try and go around it. But the opportunity out there is massive for certain use cases that will just go hit the compliance squarely on. And so I think it will assist smaller startups as well doing it when larger organizations, what I just said, other large organizations looking into coming that tokenizing of securities, I think will be really big. That's certainly consistent with my view as well, and we didn't compare notes beforehand. That will bring more credibility to the blockchain space. I think it'll help unlock seed funding as well for smaller startups who are looking to do things in the space, including where it may be a security, because at the moment, there are certain financial products which can be, there are ways to do it so it could be offered in conjunction or in effect underneath someone else's license. But if that person isn't prepared to put their license on risk for this new product, they won't do it. So if they start to get involved, you'll suddenly have organizations saying, well, hang on, I'm okay with that. We can work out an arrangement to make it happen. And that only helps further adoption. So I'm for anything that helps get real world adoption and people using it outside of mere trading and swapping value of tokens, because that's the way it'll become a sustainable industry that will mean I could continue being a full-time crypto blockchain lawyer for the rest of my career. If that doesn't happen, then I'm back to corporate law and litigation. I hope so.
So Bonnie, would you say the sort of traditional businesses that are coming into the space would have a pretty positive, positive impact on ICOs?
Look, I think it's definitely interesting because we definitely have more traditional players that are slow adopters looking into the space and scrutinizing the space and seeing what can actually be done in the space. So I definitely have people contacting me talking about doing funds to do various
So when you say
things.
traditionally like banks or funds that are not crypto funds currently?
Like big companies.
Just because like big corporates in whatever industry, right, with a lot of...
They're getting behind it. When you have people like IBM coming out with a lot more focused products, because I think they're talking about building a little chip to go in products to some crypto chip. I don't really know the details of it, but you have Amazon and Azure bringing out blockchain as a service to help companies access into it. I think a lot of them are looking more to get efficiencies out of blockchain technology within their existing business models, which is very smart. But the spin-off to that is it helps other people looking to get in and use blockchain technology as well. Also, these larger organizations don't need to run token sales. As a mechanism of funding a platform, many of them have the funding if they want to build it, and I'm sure there are a lot of skunkworks testing out blockchain deployments. I mean, an article from, I think, March has been resurfacing from a US procurement proof of concept that ran as an actual live a proof of concept test with some live vendors and cut the procurement time frame from 100 days to 10 days for US government. So things like that will get rolled out in the next year or so when they see that kind of efficiency coming out of using a blockchain deployment that has nothing to do with a token sale. So more of those kinds of things coming out, I think, will then help push the industry up further.
And also to that, closer to home, we've got the ASX rolling out the blockchain solution, and I think that really makes sense because they have to resolve between different ledgers. So, yeah, I mean,
Do you know much about that? Like, I mean, I get the sense that a lot of it, at least from last year, a lot of it is for the kind of PR benefit. Like, I wasn't sure in terms of like, are they actually doing this? Is this really going to go really out? Yeah, it is. Wow.
So the idea is because when you trade, different organisations actually hold a different ledger, and they need to reconcile at the very end of the day that all the trades actually match. So because they have to go through that manual process, that's why it takes like T3, which is 3 days, in addition to the fact that they actually need to move funds in order to settle. So really it's a twofold reason, but if they can reduce the manual labour having to actually manually sort through that, then it's a big gain for them, which is why they're using it. And I actually think it makes a lot of sense because they are actually dealing with many trades, and they all have to reconcile which trades are not.
More efficiency, more job losses.
Yeah.
Well, no, I see that as more resilience for backup, so they don't have to rely on these raw backups and trying to reconcile data. Just means you can, in some ways, I say rather than looking at the job loss, you say, look, jump back to Excel, but when Excel kind of spreadsheets were invented, a whole bunch of accountants were doing this by hand, and it cost you $1,000 to get an Excel spreadsheet done by an accountant. So then within a few years, the cost of it went down massively, but it didn't put accountants out of work. There are more per capita than there ever has been. So I think that kind of efficiency just takes the robot out of us. We don't have to do boring things.
Exactly.
And lets us do more fun things.
Yeah.
And a lot of this... Well, that's right. And what it is replacing is already largely IT functions, which are not very exciting and for people who are running on it. They're maintaining legacy systems in many cases and having a more robust central system. I strongly believe that we're not going to end up with a revolutionary decentralized economy anytime soon, but you'll have a lot of gatekeepers and trusted intermediaries like ASX using the tool to drive efficiency, which will help lower the cost of what they're delivering at the end of the day. And that is still a win for everyone, even if it does lean towards oligopolistic and monopolistic markets still. I'm more of an evolutionary blockchain person than a revolutionary one, but I think most lawyers probably are.
Fantastic. Okay, so my last question before I throw it to the floor. I know that there's a lot of young people here, very interested in this space, making a contribution. So it's also about my personal FOMO a bit about Australia and our role in this very global industry. So what advantages, if any, is there to be in Australia? Would your advice to young people who are interested in this space to just get out of here, go to other more exciting things? I mean, I get this question asked a lot in my role, working with young people who are ambitious into tech, in the tech scene. So yeah, you're both being,
Look, I think Sydney and Melbourne have an incredible depth of blockchain development talent, which is recognised when I travel around the world. People recognise that talent is here. I think that in some ways our horrifically high electricity prices have turned into an advantage in blockchain because we have, after Power Ledger has led the way, lots of other businesses looking at a market. I've even met with one foreign company coming in saying we could never do this kind of electricity play in another country without subsidies, but your price of electricity is so high that we can just do it here and still make money and still lower everyone's costs. So we have some interesting market dynamics in Australia, particularly around how we usually end up with a few big oligopolies and the so-called Australia tax that in some ways can encourage more innovation here of trying to bring down the cost of doing business using blockchains. I think for anyone who's interested in the tech, I mean, I always enjoy going and meeting with all my contacts in San Fran, and now things around Austin and Utah are getting involved in blockchain development as well. But I don't know, I love Australia, it's my home. So I think we're really lucky here to have such a safe, stable environment that has been pretty much untouched by recession for a very long time, and such a robust tech scene with such solid underpinning in the form of the R&D tax incentive that, notwithstanding rumours in newspapers, I'm not sure is going to go away in a hurry. Given the size of how much is spent, which drives a lot of tech here. I think that I spent some time living in North America, and the markets there compared to Australia, particularly around the job markets, are a lot more cutthroat. And it's just a lot more mercenary as a culture in a lot of the workplaces, and especially in tech. And I think that, you know, if I can generalise, the Australian tech is much more community-driven, and I think that is, and maybe it's my age showing, but it's something that becomes more important when you get a bit older, being in those, having that value that comes from the community that you're giving back to as well, versus just chasing a dollar or trying to build something up and flip it.
And so it's I mean, I've worked in Silicon Valley before, and I think that one of the really common things that my friends tell me is, oh, you know, I actually have unlimited holidays. And what that actually means is even if you want to take 1 week of holiday, you have to ask your manager, who may not actually give it to you. So I think that there is definitely a culture of working a lot harder, of taking pride and really working weekends and so I think that in terms of like work-life balance, I definitely would prefer Sydney. But then I think coming back to, you know, what we're trying to do, I think that in a decentralized fashion, if you believe it, even when I'm here, I get to work with companies in the Netherlands and Hong Kong and Sydney. So for me, just because I'm here doesn't actually prevent me from working with companies overseas. In fact, in May, I'm heading to ConsenSys. I'll be having a couple of business meetings in New York, and then I'm flying to San Francisco for meetings and various things, and potentially go to the Netherlands to visit my clients. So for me, it's never been a barrier, and I think that there are opportunities. You just need to pursue it and be open-minded and not really close yourself off it. But of course, if you have an opportunity to travel, to work overseas, sure. But I still think that it's a very nurturing place, and you know, if you can take a look at Daniel here, and he's been able to leverage a lot of connections and have a lot of connections overseas, I think that it's really testament to the fact that like you can be in Sydney but still feel like you're really plugged into internationally.